We apologize for the slight setback in the audio quality for this episode.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, here we are, and we've actually now got a new show. And this show is about a book, and the book I'm referring to is Turbulence. You'll also see a copy of it over the right-hand shoulder there of my guest who's coming on in a minute. And the guest I'm talking about, there you go, excellent. So you can see it's live as well. Now, the guest I'm talking about is David Banmiller. David is a retired airline executive and also author, and this is his book. Now, I don't ever remember having the chance to actually talk to somebody who has written their own book and to go through it in detail, which is what we're going to plan to do now. Every 2 weeks, we're going to go through one part of the book. So before I get too carried away with the book, David, welcome on board. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate your time.
Well, my pleasure, Chris. It's beyond looking forward to today and future discussions, episodes, and stories.
Yep, indeed. Now, just to let everybody know how this came about, we did a podcast some time ago. Firstly, David's got a fantastic voice, narrator's voice, not like my street slang. He's got a beautiful voice, beautiful tone. He's also based in Malahide in Dublin, which is a beautiful place. And he's written a book that for anybody who likes aviation, this is a lovely, lovely reflection, snapshot, little window into the industry over some 50 odd years. But the timing is perfect because our business, our industry now is coming under the spotlight of everybody. And everybody is looking at supply chains and what's happened with the passenger side of the business. Cargo's getting a higher profile. Now the vaccines. It's becoming a more interesting subject matter. So that's why we thought Turbulence, as it was written, reflecting what we're all going through at the moment. Who knows what's going to come, but at least we can now reflect on previous crisis and see how people managed through it, what the outcome was, what the learnings were, leadership styles, etc. That's the whole point of the show. So rather than me keep talking about the book, David, what I'd like to ask you first and foremost is, how did it come, or when did you decide I'm going to write a book?
Well, that's the eternal first question, isn't it? I've asked myself that many times. And you know, for everybody that says they want to write a book, for which there's a lot of people, almost nobody does, because it's a lot of hard work. So how did it begin for me? One would argue it began the first day I started with TWA as a ticket agent.
Yeah.
And then all the time in between and all the experiences. But during that whole process, I never really focused enough on it or took time or even notes to say, hey, someday, why don't I write a book? Because this is fantastic stuff. I have so many stories developing, from Hollywood stars to hijackings to union negotiations, bankruptcies. It's just a long list. But, you know, when you're in the moment, at least for me, I wasn't taking notes. I wasn't thinking book. And then when I was involved with the Southwest folks, CEO, particularly Gary Kelly and Herb before him, trying to convince them to merge with Aloha, very simply, very easily, because you're going to come to Hawaii sooner or later. I mean, that was really a hard push.
Yeah.
And I ended up in a negotiation with them, jumped on an airplane back to Hawaii, and long trip. And the story goes, and let me try to explain it this way. You're in a dark room. Your head hurts. You can't talk.
Yeah.
They can't turn the lights on because your head will just explode. You can't see anybody, and they keep giving you stuff in your arm. And this went on for 5 days. It's called intensive care. And while I was there, I could not help but reminisce rather than anything else I could do. Certainly couldn't watch TV or read. Reminisce a bit about my background, my history, and more importantly, the industry that I found myself in and why I ended up where I did in Hawaii. That was sort of the genesis of, okay, perhaps now it's time. The other thought that I had, which germinated over a couple of years since that episode, was that I really have a story to tell that supports the industry and the industry's people. And if anybody could do it, I felt I was well positioned to do it, not out of ego, by the way, quite the opposite. Out of the experiences that I saw and had with so many people in the industry, and I concluded that somebody had to tell the story of what it's really like, rather than seeing everything that you read, which is either people being maligned or videoed on an airplane about something that they did or didn't do as a flight attendant, the challenges of pilots that risk their lives all the time, and what they're doing to support industry in general. I felt perhaps now's the time. That was the genesis. And then I ended up in Palm Springs for a while with a hip recovery. And I just picked up the phone, shopped for somebody to help me, found a screenwriter in LA, helped me in Seattle. So I organized a team of label to help me organize my own or Malahide Press as the publisher, because I didn't want the publisher to tell me what I could or couldn't write and that kind of thing. That's a hard situation for a lot of people to be in, particularly CEOs. So that's the genesis of how it all started. And
I'm just thinking to myself, I'm actually trying to write a book at the moment, and I'm just thinking, thank God I'm not inspired by being in an intensive care unit or having my hip replaced. But as you said, it's such a difficult thing to actually get round to knowing when you've got enough, when you're ready to finish it, and what the message is that you want to give from that particular book.
So I engaged a group out of Seattle. Ultimately, I shopped around a little bit. And in addition to finding a screenwriter to help me, more importantly, I also needed a team, people that edit, people that do the website, people that do the design. There's people that just design book covers. There's people that just edit. There's people that do the marketing piece. It's a very long list of very, very talented people. And I use Good Friday Productions out of Seattle to do that. What's interesting is part of the story, Chris, and when you read the book, it's hard for you to imagine the first draft versus what you have, because the first draft was awful. I mean, it was like really bad. And I did a lot of dictation to Rebecca Cullen, who helped me with it. And when we brought in the editors, the first reaction from the first key editor, really smart guy, I got to say, we didn't get along right away. It's one of those, who do you think you are? But anyhow, we got through all that because actually he was right and I was wrong. And I had plastered everything on the board. And my twin brother, who's been a writer and a TV broadcaster, is still on CBS radio for millions of people every weekend, has his own opinions. And he also observed that was really pretty lousy. And I said, well, how's your book going? He said, well, it's still in chapter 4. I said, I thought it was in chapter 4 3 years ago. Anyhow, I shouldn't get into that. But so it evolved. And for anybody listening that thinks about writing a book, they should follow my path, in my opinion. So the editor came back and said, look, this is too disorganized. Lots of interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Way disorganized, because there's so much in the business. There is so much complexity. And it's hard to articulate it because it's in your brain, it's in your experiences, but to put it down in writing and sequence it so that it's a story and makes sense was not easy. And we went through a whole lot of drafts and a lot of really talented people to help me reorganize the thought process. It probably took maybe a year worth of doing that on and off.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing. I can resonate there with what you said to your brother, because I've been writing for a long time, and every now and again when I go back and revisit it, I change it or update it or modify it, and I'm spending too much time doing that than finishing the damn thing.
Well, it's interesting. I sent a book to Mike O'Leary, who's the CEO of Ryanair, biggest airline in Europe, and a really pleasant guy. I mean, he comes across rough in his demeanor because that's his style and his marketing technique. But he's done a heck of a job in Europe, obviously, with Ryanair. Yeah. I mean, he's brought travel to everybody in Ireland, cheaply. And I sent him a book a couple of weeks ago, and he dropped me a very nice letter 2 days later. And he said, in addition to enjoying your semi-retirement in Malahide with your wife and your travels, I think you should consider a follow-up book. He said, like a Turbulence 2, in other words, a post-COVID approach to things. And I may do that. As I said, writing books is not an easy task, but the end result is quite rewarding, especially when folks like you and others enjoy it and see a little bit of themselves.
Yep.
And, I've flown a couple times recently, and it's a very weird experience to walk into LAX's international terminal a couple of weeks ago with 125 check-in positions and nobody's at any of them. And the lady that checked me in at British Airways, she just got back from 6 weeks in the hospital with COVID. I mean, it's just shocking and unbelievable to watch all that. And so there is a post-COVID story.
There is indeed. There is indeed. And it'll be so different. But I think what I love about this one is that you take people on the journey from how it was and how privileged and how exciting it was to be a traveler, and even those who didn't travel, even just by going to the airport to meet a family member or a friend, or to go and go to the viewing areas, or just to be around people that were in this world that most people hadn't seen. That was such a huge opportunity for people at a time when it was exclusive.
Well, I still recall back in the early days, and even today, if you go to the landing area, just in front of the runways where roads are and people can park and gawk and watch airplanes land right above their head.
Yep.
People bring their kids, they take pictures. They're probably still doing it, but that was a big deal in the heyday. And to be as part of an aviation industry for me wasn't just a privilege. I mean, I can't believe I actually got paid to have fun virtually every day. I had a few moments where maybe it wasn't, but for the most part, fun and enjoyable. Nobody in my shoes, and people in the industry generally watches the clock. Certainly nobody in management, because you're just having a good time, whether it's checking in somebody when you're a ticket agent or being CEO on the first day of a new job, helping a critical company survive. It's an elixir of sorts. And I hope that comes through, Chris, in the writings of the book, and that people walk away at the end of the day feeling good about the industry and the people that make it happen and make it work every day.
No, it does. It does. Believe you me. And it's also good and refreshing the way you emphasize the fact that you did most of the jobs within the business. So, starting from loading cargo, even writing tickets by hand, which obviously people would think is a different world, a different planet now. But doing that, also managing airports, and then the companies that you're associated with, Pan Am, Sun Country, AirCal, American, Aloha, and also the companies that are no longer with us now, and as why, such giants of our industry didn't make it, and the reasons as to why. So, for those things, it's such a lovely, lovely, lovely story. And if I can just touch on some of the points that came to me, if you said to somebody now, I'm going to sit next to this guy called David Banmiller at dinner tonight, and I'm going to start talking to him about what he's written in his book, Turbulence. When you just start rattling off Cuban hijackings in the 70s, the Lockerbie bombings, 88, the September 11, 2001, the tech disruptions, and also what you term as the raunchy era, Come Fly With Me and Airstrip of Southwestern Airlines, all those things in this politically correct, and everybody is sort of more, more constrained now and limited as to what they can say without thinking. It was a different world. So I'd be thinking to myself, I think I need to be more than having a dinner sitting with this guy. I need to be on a weekend trip somewhere with him, fishing or in a cabin, just to listen. And when I started reading it, and obviously because I've met you and I listened to your voice, I could hear you talking and then going into it. And I thought to myself, I'd love to listen to a little bit more. What did he mean by what he said there? Why did this happen? And that's hopefully what we're going to do on this journey. So I'm looking forward to listening to you talking about the things that were of interest to me in the first place, and then just getting to know you better.
Well, there are so many stories, and I myself keep remembering stories and incidents, people I've met, things that I've been involved in. And one of the things that I would mention just off the top of my head is there's different types and personalities that can do the things I've done versus what a doctor could do. I couldn't be a doctor. I mean, I couldn't even think about it. but it takes a certain type and a certain personality. And then when you face crisis, serious crisis, like, are you going to let an airplane land? What are you going to do about a bomb threat? Real bombs going off, stepping over dead bodies, managing a real crash in the middle of the night. I mean, these are like real things. I had this unusual comfort level. It's very hard for me to explain, but I go into when I'm in an emergency situation or a dynamic situation, I get into kind of a zone where I'm calm on the outside. My brain is going crazy. I'm trying to figure out 6 different ways to get to the end result. But in the meantime, you have to be calm, not just for yourself, but for those around you, because everybody's watching. When you evacuate Terminal 3 at LAX because a bomb is blown up at the next terminal, and everybody's running out the front door, and the police are called, and the LAPD comes marching in, 100 of them in cadence, like they're in the army. 10 peeled off at the first terminal, 10 at the second terminal. And I had some friends at the LAPD, so I lobbied to get the first dogs, the dog sniffers, because it was August, everybody's out in the parking lot. Hotter than heck. And so who goes in first with the LAPD and the dogs? Do I have any volunteers? Well, I went in, and I had a couple of other lads that went in with me, and we inspected the place and then opened up again. In those situations, there's only a certain kind of personality, I think, that can manage their way through that process. And then the interesting thing is, how do you tell people about that afterwards, and how do you write about it, and how do you capture the mood and the challenge and the environment and the decision-making process in the midst of all that? And then is there a kernel of learning that you could teach or explain to people about how to manage yourself through trauma and crisis?
And I think it was you who said about your brain. When your brain is racing, your tongue has to slow right down.
Pretty much. And that's a good thing for everybody to think about. Whether it's a politician or a U.S. president. Or,
that's a definite.
I could go on and on, right? But I won't.
100%. No, that's really, really valid advice there. But now what we've decided to do is we've decided to break it down now into nice small chunks. So obviously we're going to go through the basic introduction today and the epilogue, and then we're going to break down, why you chose it in parts. So part 1, part 2, part 3, why you chose the core subject matter as being people, infrastructure, and business, and then the various chapters within. So we're going to do one of those every 2 weeks. So I'm looking forward to quite some time getting to know you now.
Well, I hope I don't bore you in the process.
No, you won't, because I've already read the book, so I know you won't. So that's a definite no. But I just think now it's a great opportunity to get a little bit more deeper into it, and to get to know you better, and also what are the standout areas for you. Now, one of the things that I remember right in the very beginning, almost at the beginning, was where you were talking about swapping a suit for an Hawaiian shirt. And also you said that you looked a little like George Clooney in The Descendants. And then modestly, you then said maybe George Clooney's older brother. But I looked at some of the pictures in there. You look good, Dave. You look good. So now let's go into a little bit now of when you actually started. So in the prologue, you talk about your reputation and the fact that you had become known as the airline doctor because you'd taken more airlines through bankruptcy than any other CEO. Now, that's almost like a recipe for a health explosion or putting yourself under pressure. Why did you accept so many challenges that were, most people would want to run a mile from?
Chris, that's an interesting question. I've been asked that many times. And in fact, I recall sitting at lunch with Norm Mineta, who was Secretary of Transportation under George Bush. And in fact, Norm was the guy that pushed the button to close down the domestic system the day of 9/11. Fascinating guy. I've known Norm since he was mayor of San Jose many, many years ago. Norm helped us when I was there, Cal, getting into Vancouver, because we did some politics back and forth, because I wanted the Canadian crowd coming into San Jose and then on to Palm Springs, because there's a lot of Canadians in Palm Springs, particularly
Yep.
during the season. So anyhow, so I'm with Norman, head of the FAA, Marion Blakey's the next table. And it's sort of fun because the Navy stewards serve you and you're overlooking the White House. It's kind of a sexy thing. And I said, Norm, the answer, I'm not sure I know the answer, except I love a challenge. And these things are offered to me. When I did Pan Am, that was the first opportunity. And then all of a sudden I got a bit of a reputation, I suppose, for doing really, really hard jobs and doing it with a certain perhaps skill and understanding. And then you have to be good in court because you end up playing the game in court.
Yeah.
I got feeling comfortable about all that. And then when people called and said, I've got this problem at Sun Country, or worse, Aloha, that had no money at all, I guess I gravitated towards it. And I enjoy the challenge, I suppose, a great deal.
I can imagine. Like, obviously, we're gonna go through in a lot of detail the various chapters of the book, but just quickly now, just to get people who are listening to this now to think, I wonder what he's going to cover. Obviously, if you look back, and one thing that you've been very good at, and in the discussions we've had, is about, you know, failing fast, learning faster, and understanding why. And some of the things that you've done, if you were to give advice to a brand new David Banmiller who was starting out again on that same route, what do you think the most important thing you would say to him before he took on those tasks would be?
Well, the underlying theme would be gain experience in every discipline within your industry. Because if you do that, and I'm talking about all positions that you could possibly have,
Yeah.
in my case, from ticket agent to CEO and all the jobs in between. But guess what? That probably applies to accounting firms and hotel chains
Yeah.
and so on, is learn your business from the bottom up. Because when you do that, aside from appreciating the industry more and your company more, people respect you more
Yes.
because they can't fool you. I mean, I had a lot of times when I was CEO in different companies trying to get the on-time performance turned around, which I did in every case, but they couldn't con me because they would give an excuse about a delay, and I'd say, that's odd. I don't really think that was the reason for the delay on these daily conference calls with maintenance and stations. And they get back the following day and said, how did you know,
Yeah.
Dave? And I said, well, I was a gate agent once. I know how they play the game about coding delays. So I would say gain experience. That'd be my first comment. And every pilot that I chat with in the cockpit and give a little bit of my background, invariably say, I wish our CEO had that kind of background.
Yeah. No, you're right. And those three letters, OTP, have caused so much infighting, so much baloney, and so much fabrication and creativity. It's a ridiculous thing. And if you don't understand it or you don't know the background behind it, you know, you can really be given a pony and trap exercise of the worst.
And I also think in terms of perhaps another way to cut the answer to your question is to try to kind of like a sponge,
Yeah.
try to pull in knowledge just about people, about your industry, about what goes on in your industry, so that you could become knowledgeable without being arrogant. In other words, there's nothing that beats knowledge. And there are wise people and there are smart people, but some smart people aren't wise and some wise people aren't smart. And you get wisdom mostly based on experience.
Yeah.
And you know, you're a heck of a lot wiser as you get older because you've had a few bumps along the highway, right?
Oh,
Some
yeah.
mistakes. I've often said that sometimes you're better because of your mistakes rather than your successes. And people see success and they believe their own press clippings,
Yeah.
which is usually a mistake.
That's a dangerous thing to do. Yeah. Now, David, one of the things in the prologue that you mentioned was about, you know, certain crystallized moments in time, you know, illuminating not only how connected we all are because of the airline industry, but also how dependent we are upon it. And, you know, none truer than the current pandemic and situation we're going through, but every single previous crisis, it's made people appreciate the supply chain, how much reliance there is on speed and convenience, but on the entire industry. Now, at the moment, obviously the cargo side of the business is getting a is becoming under the spotlight. But it's incredible how, with all of that in mind, and every time we go through one of these bumps or these, you know, these fall off of a precipice, people then still, you know, they look at the airline business and it's still maligned. You know, it's still harshly judged, and you know the memory is short, and then something else happens, and then they get a bad time again. You know, I personally, obviously, as somebody who's spent 40 odd years in the business, you know, I think it's unfair.
It's at least unfair, so ill-founded, and in many cases, people make observations and they have no idea what they're talking about. As an example, you know, I was on a flight a couple of weeks ago, and the flight attendant announced, in addition to the normal safety announcement, no cameras, no videos, no pictures. Now, that's interesting because some people get maligned when somebody's pulled off an airplane and film it, and it's on ABC Evening News or CNN.
Yeah.
How often do you see that happening?
Yeah.
You only see one side of that story.
Yeah.
So when you talk about how the public gets this opinion, it's because of things like that. And it's not a perfect industry, good heavens. But we fly 750,000 people in the heyday, beginning of this year before COVID, flying all over the world. And it's a complex business. And there's going to be a few hiccups here and there. And occasionally an employee might make a misjudgment. But my God, you know what it's like managing the general public? I mean, they're not all really, really nice, regardless of what we say in public and private. The fact is, there are some people you'd like to throw off the airplane. And I personally have thrown a few people off. And I've also put a few people on the no-fly list. And we're delighted to do it.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And very, very diplomatically put there. Yeah. There's people in all walks of life, from all backgrounds, and that's the one thing that's consistent through mankind, is that you're going to get good and bad everywhere.
Well, let's talk about a couple of the bullets that I mentioned in the book, just off the top of my head. Like, one is food. Now, early in my career, I ran the dining unit in Los Angeles for TWA. So I know a little bit about putting food on airplanes. And it's extremely difficult to take LA to London, 10 or 11 hours. You got dinner, snack, breakfast. Everything's got to be fresh. Everything's got to be like in your local restaurant, and then some. And the airline does, at least did until right now, we're just getting box lunches, did a really quality job. And it isn't easy to feed 300 people for 11 hours. And you got the microwave ovens. The other interesting point is, imagine the packing diagrams in a galley. I'm kind of awful. I lived this life. And when I was at American, running international, I was responsible for giving advice on the in-flight product internationally. And every time I flew overnight, flight attendants would come and sit down next to me and say, right in the aisle, and start chatting about things like the wine or the food service. And I absorbed all of it because I felt part of my job was to take their problems back to the people making the decisions on food service. But imagine all the feeding 300 people or whatever, especially in first class and business class, and having choices. And you only have so much room in a galley. So and then you have to design the galley. Okay, do you have to reach up? Do you have to reach down? How do you keep this warm? What about keeping that cold? What's the quality of it? And then the flight attendants, after every flight, usually fill out a detailed report saying, well, the filet was wrong, or they didn't like the bangers on the overnight coming into London, or the eggs were soft or they were hard. All that stuff I would get every day from the previous day, and sit down and go through that to try to improve the quality of the food product. Now, the average customer doesn't know that. It doesn't appreciate the incredible detailed involvement it is to put that plate before you.
Yeah. And I think, and equally, they don't know that. And to be fair, they don't care about that because they've got expectations. But what I think is a good thing is when people are explained what goes into it, you know, some of the communication, some of the information, even in the magazines, you know, if they sort of explain the reasons why and how and everything, I think it's going to start to become of interest because people do care a little bit more now. I think my wife flew with British Airways for over 20 years, and my daughter currently flies with British Airways now. So the issues you're talking about now and the problems with the galley and everything, I've heard that many times, but to be fair, it works like clockwork most of the time. It's absolutely incredible.
Well, British Airways is amongst the best, in my opinion. You know, you take a flight between Heathrow or Gatwick and Dublin, 55 minutes in the air, maybe.
Yep.
How much of that is serving time? And in business class, 20 people, they put out a full service, breakfast, lunch, or dinner with drinks. I mean, they're so well organized. They're some of the best and pretty decent food. In fact, I like the breakfast from Dublin to London. Unfortunately, not too many of them right now.
Yeah. No, you're right there. Now, Dave, also in the book now, we cover from the 50s all the way up to, you know, to the current times. And you talk about the glamour of flying, you know, and I remember it was such a privilege. I remember the first upgrade I ever got, you know, when I was working for Lufthansa. Oh my God, what a different world, you know, being up in the bubble on a 747 and the way it was treated. It was incredible. An experience I'll never forget. Same thing with Etihad was absolutely superb. Qatar was great. Saudi, of recent times, you know, they've improved their in-flight services. Absolutely superb with the chefs. It's an incredible experience. But then people are also now talking about the way the whole experience has been cheapened. And you've got very clear opinions on both.
Well, you say cheap, and that's an easy word to kind of throw out there, but it's a lot more complex than that. People want value for their money. They don't necessarily appreciate that in an airline flight as they would buying a Mercedes versus a Ford versus a BMW versus a Lexus or whatever. It's kind of more tangible, and you kind of look at it and you drive it and you feel it a certain way. With an airplane ticket, it's so much more complex. And as I said previously, and I'll reword it, when people buy a ticket, they want to have it, they want to be safe. They want to leave on time. They want to get there on time. They want to get their bag there quickly, and they want to be alive. And they want to fly for free. I mean, that's sort of the beginning of the customer thought process, right?
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't exactly work that way. You take the cost of the airplane, the fuel, the lease rates, and all the landing fees and all the other stuff that comes into that airplane on a block hour basis. And then you take the number of seats and you just divide and you say, okay, with X load factor, which normally is like about 75, 78% break even. Now that varies, you know, with fuel. Today's break even is a whole different story, but under normal conditions, call it 75 to 80% break even load factor. So what do? You use yield management to adjust the price based on demand. And you have forecasts out 330 days, and you know what the demand was on Friday at 3:00 in the afternoon for the past 25 years.
Yeah.
And that's all in the computer, and then it's updated. And that's how you do your pricing. It's a little bit like when you're betting on a horse and the odds change. The odds are changing based upon who's betting, right? The odds a week ago aren't the same odds as they are just before the race starts.
Yeah.
Pricing is actually the same way. And I just thought about it as I'm brainstorming with you that when the airline looks 30 days out and says, boy, there's a lot of demand here, so I guess we kind of close the bucket on the cheap seats, right?
Yep.
Cheap seats are there not because necessarily people are cheap, although they want value for money, but because there's a certain segment of society that flies that is price sensitive, and there's some that aren't.
Yeah.
And it's not a whole lot different than you don't sell shovels to shovel snow in July because it's not snowing. And some people take advantage of that, you know, when hurricanes come and overpricing and so on. But in the airline industry, it is very sophisticated in terms of the pricing. And the other driver, of course, is the competition. We always used to say that you're as smart as your dumbest competitor or something like that when you're pricing, because particularly when I was on the West Coast, very, very vicious price wars all the time. And I suppose it's still around today to some extent on every city pair, but every airline watches what every other airline charges and what the demand is, and then they flex it. And the pricing isn't out there to gouge people or to make the CEO another 100,000 on his bonus. It isn't true, but a lot of people believe that. They think, including my twin brother sometimes, you know, he'll call in and he'll want to book a first class seat, let's say, to come to Dublin, but he doesn't book it. And then a day later, he goes back and he said the price went up because the algorithm knows that I, on my computer, want that flight, so they just raised the price.
Yeah.
And I said, pray to God you're kidding, because I don't think the computer and the yield management people are waiting for this individual to come back 24 hours later and add 50 euro to his.
Yeah.
People believe.
Yeah, no, I can believe that. Now, there's so much detail in the book, and there's so much general history, and it's a lovely read, Dave. Honestly, I really look at it, and it what it did when I started to read it, it was bringing back memories for myself, things that I've seen and what I've done, where I've been to, and just crazy. I remember once I was in South America, and some tough old times, and I can remember in the terminal, and it was so crowded, and getting down to the gate and everything, and the pushing and everything to get on the aircraft. And I remember, I won't say which airline, but I stepped on the aircraft, and they said, "Welcome home, sir." And that relief.
Oh, yeah.
And then getting into a lovely seat, and you think to yourself, this is it, fantastic. The pleasure was incredible. Now, on one flight, a long time ago, I was coming back from a golf day, and I've still got the little golf tees and the little photo, and it's Pan Am. And it must be a collectible now, I'd imagine. But when you think about how big they were, and something that you also mentioned in the book as well is about how the titans of the industry of old, your Pan Am, TWA, Braniff, and various others, how on earth and who would have thought that they would fail, that they would go under? It's incredible. Now, you were there, so you know the reasons why, and you've probably seen some of those issues repeat themselves, as history often does. But it was unfathomable then. But then again, you look at the Titanic impact or the Titanic effect, and nothing can stay afloat forever if it's not being run properly.
Well, it's an interesting point, and I'm thinking through this titans of the industry issue. The egos are different today, Chris. Back in the day, as they say,
yep,
maybe the 40s, the 50s, 60s, like when the Juan Trips of this world said, "I need a big airplane, build me a 747." That was him. He probably had a board of directors, but that was him. Today, the responsibilities are spread out through pretty strong boards. So you get a little bit of air out of the balloon from the previous titans, because you can't unilaterally, like they were able to do, in the 40s, 50s, and even 60s. You don't have that kind of power today. So the world is also different in terms of management and decision making. But there was a lot of ego driven at the time. People wanted big airplanes, and they put the big airplanes on the wrong routes.
Yep.
That's classic. You take a 747 and fly it for an hour or two, and you might as well just throw the money out the window. I mean, if you're not flying at 10 hours, it doesn't work. And you have to fly airplanes to make money. Aircraft utilization is also very important. But these folks had a certain, jealousy is not the right word, between competitors, but there was a level of competitiveness, some ego, some poor decision making, and sort of a different topic, but the same topic is the co-pilot used to always listen to the captain. And a lot of crashes were caused because the captain was so powerful.
Yeah, and they wouldn't stand up to him.
And then they developed this training program, which improved the dialogue within the cockpit between the pilot and the co-pilot. And that was a safety feature that is all the airlines train now. So it's a backdoor way of saying you have to manage the egos of people in a way that makes for sound judgment. And that wasn't always the case.
Yeah. Now, can I ask you something, right? You talked about egos, and you also mentioned about, the business attracted men with big egos. Now, why did they allow that to happen? And for the impacts of that, to go on for so long without being curtailed or being controlled?
Well, I think part of it was the times. I mean, the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, particularly. I mean, I lived through those wild times. You know, in the US, they had the show called Mad Men.
Yeah,
And I lived through Mad Men. I mean, you go out, I didn't do it, but a lot of guys would go out to lunch, have a couple of martinis, bottle of wine, after dinner drinks, and go back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And when I was in the field, I would call those same guys if I needed equipment. I wouldn't call in the morning. I'd call in the afternoon because I knew that I get the 10 tugs and 15 loaders that I wanted in the afternoon. Back in those days, the world was different. I mean, why did TWA hire a Peter Sellers? He offended everybody.
oh
Had
yeah, yeah.
goofy ads, and who filtered it? Let me give another example, just to say, how do you ever do that? When TWA put in this new Peter Sellers and the world, they had paper uniforms, 4 different uniforms for flight attendants. And it was one for England, one for Rome, one for Paris, one for New York. Well,
Yeah.
guess what? Nobody checked with the FAA. They were paper mache. So they spent millions and millions, put them in. All the flight attendants had them. And the FAA said, excuse me, those things are not fire resistant. They had to all go off the airplane. In addition, some designer somewhere said, wouldn't it be cool if the seats were all of different colors? So they had different seats on the 747, multicolored. Nobody asked maintenance. Well, what happens if somebody gets sick in Tulsa? And because you can't inventory every seat, because they had like 12 different seat patterns on one airplane. How do you inventory that to 100 stations and 100 maintenance spaces? Well, of course you can't,
Yep.
but nobody ever asked them that. So it's another way of trying to answer your question, which is very provocative. In Are we more insulated today from the arrogant behavior of individualism by the
Yep.
people at the top or not? And I would say a combination of the CEOs and the people at the top today, I think, are more measured. I think the boards have more influence. And I think the history and the past, if people learn from the past, have seen those mistakes and don't make the same ones, you'd have never seen what happened to TWA in some of those crazy times in the 70s ever happen today on American Airlines. I mean, it just wouldn't happen. There's too many safeguards in the decision-making process to avoid tragic mistakes. Not that some aren't made anyhow.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's everything changes, everything improves, and the point you made there, it was a different world. When people look back, and obviously, the older we get, the better we were. Whether it's in sport, whether it's in business, whether it's in romance, whatever you want to say. But when you do look back, sometimes you see it through rose-tinted glasses. But there was a huge difference. The opportunity for people to fly wasn't as freely as it is now. The need for people to fly within business and everything, we've been so lucky, I think, over this last 20 to 30 years. It's been absolutely incredible. Now, to see how that will change again in the next 20 or 30 years is something that I can't get my head around, because obviously some of the most successful businesses are in the LCC sector, with the volumes and the turnaround and the way they do things. And then from a customer experience perspective, you've got the other end of the spectrum. You've got your Emirates, your Etihads, you've got all the different types of business and first class options that are there, and the lounges that go with it. Now we're challenged with all of this cash flow and cost issue. Where do you think the balance is going to be now over the next 20 years?
Well, let me answer it first. Short term, the next year or two, we're going to see an evolution, and it's not going to be the good old days. I think someday we'll get back to some of that, but because of culture issues, expense issues, the environment that we're going to deal with, plus the environment itself,
Yep.
are going to put some safeguards on whatever we used to do before versus what we do going forward. But at the same time, human behavior is human behavior. Human expectations are expectations. People want to fly safe and they want to be taken care of. So the service piece of the industry will always be significant because it draws passengers. It's in the DNA of the industry, service and safety. I don't think that's going to disappear. Routes will be different. Airplanes will be faster. I mean, supersonics will be around again, in my opinion, over the next 20 years. There's going to be hotels on the moon. certainly maybe not 20 years, but pretty close thereafter. You're going to be able to take a holiday overnight up in a space station and go around the world, and all that's going to happen. It's just a question of time. And there are airplanes on the drawing boards now that'll get you there twice, 3 times as fast without some of the dilemma that the original Concorde had. I mean, the Concorde had very high maintenance, huge fuel burn, and sort of a bad history in some respects. But you're going to see a change in speed, equipment, and look what happened. Wide bodies, and now there's more narrow bodies.
Yeah.
At one point, the 380 was the talk of the town, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And everybody said, well, that's the future, especially Emirates, which may still work. But people said, drive into the hubs and then the hubs into the spokes with the smaller airplanes. Well, people now want to go not A to B to C, they want to go A to C.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it changes your route structure. Okay. When you change your route structure and the populations and the population base, well, guess what happens? The type of equipment you need for that city pair is different. So I think you're going to see some structural changes in routes that are because of some of the issues I just mentioned, including population base,
Yeah.
cities, what's working, competition, that sort of thing.
Yeah. When you were talking about, the 747s on short trips, I was thinking to myself as well, you look at just recently, with the amount of 380s that were flying on trips that didn't make sense as well. It's something that I'm sure in a few years' time, people will look back and there'll be a study on which strategy was the best. And they'll be comparing the different airlines' tactical approach to the aircraft they had. And I mean, it's going to be interesting to see which ones are the more resilient through various types of crisis or turbulence. So it's going to be fascinating.
There's an interesting thought that came to mind. Years ago, I was visiting Gordon Bethune, longtime friend of mine, when he was running Continental, and he was turning it around, and he wrote the book Worst to First. And Gordon was a test pilot and a Navy guy, and funnier than anything, really, really smart guy. And I was chatting with him, and I said, well, how are you fixing Continental? And he said, well, amongst other things, one of the things I looked at was the route map and the city pairs. And he said, well, why are we flying 2 or 3 different types of equipment to the same city?
Yep.
Because you have to inventory the parts, maintenance issues, gates. So I said, gosh, that makes so much sense. He says, so what I did was I said, well, let's just fly, if we can, that single MD-80 instead of a Boeing airplane into that city, and we just have to have parts for that city. He redid the whole route structure based upon economics, amongst other things, demand and all the other usual stuff. But that was a very intuitive approach that went past an awful lot of people. Somebody asked me a few years ago on a consulting gig to take a look at United. And I said, well, the first thing that comes to mind is they have too many airplane types. And the guy in Wall Street looked at me and said, well, what's wrong with that? I said, well, do you have any idea what it costs to train pilots? Just start with pilots. Forget maintenance, forget parts.
Yeah.
Types. You need one engine for every 6 engines in terms of spares. So just throw that one out there. And then where are you going to put the spare engines in your route system? And then pilots. When you train a pilot, not just go left seat or the right seat to the left seat, but just to be on that particular equipment type, they go through retraining. So now you have seniority issues. Yep. So you put in another fleet type and all the guys move around. And the training costs are like 25, 30,000 simulator costs per pilot. So the more different airplanes you have in your fleet, the number of expense issues you're exposed to is extraordinary. And guess what? Lots of people never even thought about it that way. But now, United had a lot of different leadership changes that may have been part of it.
Yeah, but David, it's an interesting thing now, and don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking any consultants whatsoever, because I've done a bit myself. But sometimes you look at something and you think, why has somebody not thought of this, or why have they allowed it to slip through, or why has it manifested now to a situation where somebody can come in and say, well, this doesn't make sense, or have you questioned this, or why are you doing this? Why does that cycle keep turning and keep turning, and it keeps churning out the same dilemmas?
Well, consultants have a certain role. I mean, I've been a consultant from time to time. I'd rather run a company than consult for one. Frankly, it's a heck of a lot more fun. But it's experience, and a really good consultant is more than just particulars. In other words, you have a broad level of experience, managerial experience, process experience. Early on in my career at TWA, I learned value analysis training, which is one of the things they used when they built the 747. And you flow chart all the processes. And let's say, wow, you've got 10 steps in this process. How do we cut it to 8 or 7 or 6? That's sort of the mindset of a consultant. So there are times when an operating guy thinks moving the iron, he thinks operating procedures, whereas a consultant has a broader page to look at because they look at things more in terms of the process and how you can make the process more efficient. So the really good consultants serve a purpose, and sometimes the operating guy doesn't see what a guy from the outside can see.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? And it just seems to be something that keeps turning and keeps turning, and at a certain point, the same sort of reflection or review or health check needs to be done.
Here's an interesting thought, and it reminds me of something I learned from Dave Nealman early on. This was actually pre-JetBlue, and he was, he had Morris Air, and when he sold it, he went to work for Herb at Southwest, and that was short-lived because, his kind of approach to things was different than Southwest, and they had a meeting of the minds, and he left, and they ultimately started JetBlue after 5 years because he had a non-compete for 5 years with the sale. But Dave said when he started JetBlue, he didn't want silos. Yep. So if you take a look at Americans, I think done a pretty good job, and others probably eliminating silos. But from a technology point of view and an IT point of view, there were so many silos. So maintenance had its own IT setup and software and information. And then marketing had theirs. And then finance had so they were all silos. And they didn't talk to each other. Well, what Dave said was, when I start JetBlue, I'm going to start with a platform that interrelates between all the different disciplines. Seems simple, doesn't it?
Yep, it does. Logic.
And that's what he did. It's one of the successes of JetBlue, and people probably never focused on that because it was perhaps too much in the weeds, but it was a smart thing to do, and a lot of people learned from it, especially carriers that started up after that.
Yeah. No, you're right, Dave. Now, we've mentioned as well about some of the unfair PR that the carriers get, and you also stated as well, once we get out of this pandemic, this crisis, the next big thing that's going to hit the industry is going to be sustainability, and sustainability with regards to environmental issues. So there are a lot of myths that people assume that relate to our industry. One of them being flying is expensive. Well, it's proven now that it doesn't have to be. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Air travel is one of the leading causes of global warming. Okay, and I've spoken with lots of private aviation, and now with some of the new equipment that's coming in, and that's also not true to fact. The federal government is always there to help the traveller. Airline food, airline food has to be awful. It's almost like a passage that if you're going to travel, you've got to be able to tolerate the terrible food. You've got airline seats are too close together because of greed. Okay, so you've spoken about the pitch of seats and how it works, etc. You're talking about airline personnel are grouchy and service always stinks. Here's one that you would probably resonate with you. Airline CEOs are overcompensated. Now, I'm sure you've got a comment or two on that one. And when you see CEOs and some of the CEOs that I've worked under, and a couple that are quite dynamic and different, but sometimes similar, James Hogan and Mr. Al-Backer, they are guys who know their mind so much, but you sort of walk away from a business review meeting or a major session with them, you think to yourself, my God, how do they get to sleep at night with all they have to remember, everything they're accountable for, and all those responsibilities? So whenever anybody says to me, these CEOs are overcompensated, I would say, oh, no.
Let me give you two experiences that come to mind from the points that you just raised. Jerry Grinstein, when he was CEO at Delta, and I've known Jerry from when he ran Western. He tried to hire me years ago when I was at Air Cal. And when I was trying to sell Aloha or get a partner, I went to see Jerry. He was CEO of Delta, and they were getting ready to face their own problems. And believe it or not, we helped Jerry and Delta, little old Aloha. We had great advisors, and we had great attorneys, great finance guys
Yep.
taking us through bankruptcy. We actually gave our game book to Jerry for Delta. And I have a note, I might even have it in the book, of Jerry sending a very kind note thanking me for that. But the point of it was, when Jerry, he walked away from $10 million. When they came out of bankruptcy, they said, here, we want to give this to you. He said, no, that's okay. Spread it out amongst the employees. Now, he was a CEO. When you talk about pricing and pitch, you can have whatever you want. If you want all the seats to be 36 inches apart, you're going to pay for it. You remember my comment about cost per block hour?
Yep.
Cost per block hour is X. If you put 10 seats in, it's going to cost this amount of money. If you put 50 seats in, 200 seats in, 300 seats in, you simply divide, and that's the cost. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say, God, this seat's kind of tight, but I really like my $99 fare. But if you sit down and explain it to people, they sort of say, well, I guess that makes sense. But if we don't explain it, or we don't have that kind of dialogue, and I think sometimes we as an industry fail in that regard. I mean, we try very hard.
100%.
We don't get there. We don't get.
That is something that we have got to do better moving forward. So whether it's people that are in the departure lounge and they've got a few minutes waiting, what you put on the screens, what information you give in the seat pockets, what information you give on the websites, different types of information to help people understand why things are done the way they are, so that they can really appreciate not just the experience, but everything that goes into making that experience more accessible to everybody in the world, not just maybe a once in a lifetime flight or once a year, but makes it accessible for things that are important for people.
We try. A4A, which used to be Air Transport Association, but is now Airlines for America, and there's one for Europe, Airlines for Europe, is a trade association, and the CEOs meet every quarter. I was on that board for 4 years, and their assignment is to represent the carriers and carry the message. Now, they do a lot of lobbying, by the way, because you have to have a voice in Congress and in the White House. Otherwise, you don't get it done. You have to have your voice heard. But I think the industry can do a better job. It's really hard to get people's attention, by the way. You can't even get their attention when you're doing an emergency announcement, when you think about it.
Exactly.
But it's hard to get their attention, and there's so much noise out there these days. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't still try, because the industry has a story to tell. And there's, it's not a shell game. It's not see how you move around the P's. It's not that at all. And in terms of compensation, you can make a heck of a lot more money in other disciplines and environments than in the airline industry. You got to really love it to be in the industry.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Once it gets into your blood, it's hard to get out.
It's almost like cocaine. It's unbelievable. It's just, I've had so many people in the industry tell me the same thing. It's also a camaraderie. It's something that's hard to explain. We were checking in at British Airways a couple of weeks ago out of LA, and the ticket agent recognized my name. He started talking about my experience. Oh, my mother used to work for Pan Am for 30 years. And then 2 other agents came over, and then the flight attendants started. And I didn't even know them, but it's a camaraderie within the industry that is hard to explain. Maybe every industry has it. I don't know, but we're peculiar because we fly all over the world. I mean, I've got friends all over the world. Why? Because I've been all over the world.
Yeah.
It's that kind of an industry, and there's certain type of people that want to be engaged in it. At Southwest, when you interview for flight attendants jobs, you got to tell a bunch of jokes, and you got to really be funny, because they don't want some dull person working at Southwest. If you notice, the cultural differences there are dramatic, and the better jokes that you can tell, the better flight attendant you usually become.
Yeah, that's not a bad thing to do, though, is it?
No, and especially when you're on an airplane and people get uptight. I might have mentioned to you before, but when the average human walks into a terminal, they change because it's outside their comfort zone. and they take off on an airplane at 30, 40,000 feet. They're bumping along, and some people are more nervous than others, but they're not in total control. Not that you are in anything in life, but you are in less control. And it reminds me of a flight between Montego Bay and Kingston. I was with my soon-to-be wife, and she was sitting with the Minister of Tourism for Jamaica. And I was in the cockpit. And we were going between the two cities, very, very bad thunderstorm. It's a 25-minute flight. And we're in the front. We're zipping through the dark clouds and the lightning. We're having a terrific time. Hey, got it over here. They're so scared in the back that, I mean, they thought they were going to die. And we're up in the cockpit having a great time. Why? Because we knew what was going on.
Yeah.
We were in command, we were in control, and we saw what was happening, whereas people in the back had no clue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's good to be in the back and not knowing what's going on. But I totally agree. When people understand why things happen, you know, they appreciate it more. And I just think our industry is so unique that when an aircraft is anywhere in the world on that piece of tarmac, all the businesses and all the support services that go on around it, people can't imagine. So whether you're an accountant, an engineer, a technician, administrator, whatever it is you are, you can be associated with that aircraft in some way or another.
And you remind me of a feeling that I have, like when I was with an American and I was in Tokyo, and that was part of my responsibilities internationally. And I remember watching American's airplane come in at Narita.
Yeah,
it felt good. That was your company. That was your airline. It had a certain emotional draw.
Yeah,
And I'm sure you felt the same thing.
yeah.
It part of that is just the nature of the industry. Part of that is the fact that we really are all over the world.
Yep.
And we're sort of like citizens of the world.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. And you said about, you know, a new destination, inaugural flight or whatever, when they get the old water cannon, you know, the arch, it's a wonderful thing to see. Or if you're lucky enough to be on the first flight, it's brilliant. I absolutely love it. I think it's one of the best things in the world. And then once you realize how many industries or businesses or services that evolve around that aircraft, then you've got to say, and it happens in every single airport in the world.
If you take a look at Heathrow Airport on a busy day like last year, and you count the number of airplanes, and just put a price tag for fun of 75 million, because some are 50 million, some are 100 million, right? And you look at the number of airplanes, and if you think about it from a capital investment point of view, there's like billions and billions of dollars sitting there at Heathrow Airport alone. And I had the fortune to fly in when I was with Air Jamaica. They were still building Terminal 5. And so in the cockpit, had a great view coming in to see how they were building in this big hole in the ground, which is now some huge building. And they did a great job. But all the people that were involved in the infrastructure and the development of that airport are also part of the industry.
Yep. No, it's unique. It's incredible. And it's a fantastic thing. And that's why, just as we're starting on this journey of your book, you know, there's so many people that have been displaced now because of the practical sizing. And obviously our thoughts go out to them, and hopefully one day very soon they'll get back into the business. Now, coming back to how we started, which was you in a hospital bed, I don't think we actually explained why you were in the bed. And with the I mean, that's something I'm sure you're okay to share that with everybody.
Well, sure. At the time, we kept it secret, but I was flying back from Southwest trying to get them to come in with Aloha through the bankruptcy process and buy us. And I ended up I went from Jamaica to Dallas, then over to Honolulu, and sat down with the flight attendants that same afternoon to negotiate a merger agreement between the unions at United, because the pilots were actually in Chicago, our pilots and United's pilots, working on an integration agreement. And we actually had it done. I mean, this is phenomenal stuff, because some airlines took years. And I went out to dinner and felt like somebody hit me with a baseball bat. And the bottom line is I had a brain aneurysm. Yeah. And I tried to get back to my condo, and the concierge there pretty much saved my life. He had an ambulance there very quickly. And I was already, I mean, within 5 minutes, the ambulance guys had me juiced up because I was really going crazy. But I still had the presence of mind to pick up the phone, the cell phone, and call my secretary and patch in the doctor. And he said, don't take aspirin because aspirin and brain aneurysm, you don't make it. And I said, I
didn't know that.
Yeah, because it's a blood thinner.
Yeah.
So I said, get my senior staff to meet me at the emergency room. This is like a movie. And I'm kind of high now, man, because it got me juiced up. But they met me in the emergency room, and I gave each one of them an assignment. I gave the CFO my BlackBerry at the time, and I said, you're me, because nobody can know that I'm in here. We're negotiating with United to save this airline, and people cannot know. They registered me anonymously. You couldn't find me at Queens Hospital. I didn't exist. And their PR people made sure that's like, PR guy got one assignment, the marketing guy got another assignment, the ops guy got another assignment, and that was the team. And I was in hospital for 2 weeks, 4 or 5 days in intensive care, and you couldn't get in touch with me. Yet the pilots were negotiating. I remember when I kind of came out of it after the first week, I was still in bed, and I was talking to our pilots in Chicago who were asking my advice on how we should handle who gets to fly out of Orange County, what equipment types are we going to use, the typical integration between two airlines pilots groups are. And I'm in the middle as a CEO, and they respected me enough, I suppose, to ask for my input and help, which I was really wanted to do. They never knew I was in a hospital bed.
Yeah.
And I didn't want them to know. In fact, some of them, unless they've read the book now, probably still don't know.
That's amazing.
But that's how I ended up in there, right in the middle of trying to cut a final deal with an airline, either Southwest or actually United at the time, where we went to the board of directors with United taking over Aloha, and that's when fuel hit $148.
Yeah.
And the board shut it down, and that was it for Aloha.
Yeah.
The story. But
incredible influence
right in the middle of all that. That was one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. I said, that's an interesting way to start a book, is a story about real life and what it means.
It is, and how close it can be to change it. But also, it's the last page of the prologue, and the point on the last page is that little prescription for your future from your doctor, Dr. Hook, who actually said, I recommend you do not take on a job of CEO or CEO of another bankrupt airline.
Yeah, he actually filled that out, and total surprise to me in my last visit, because I had some brain surgeons and him and some other people involved. And he gave me that, and I cherished it. I saved it, and I said, I ought to just put that in the book. People won't believe it, but it's actually a true story.
Yeah. It reads well, and it looks good on that last page, as I said in the prologue. Now, for me, it's a pleasure talking to somebody like yourself, and listening, and the things that you talk about and what I've read brings back great memories of my life as well. And sometimes you need something to share those memories with yourself again, and realize how important and how nice they were. So it's been lovely. Now we're going to carry on. The next show, we're going to start breaking things down. So you've written the book in 3 parts. So part 1 is about people. So next time we're going to look at chapter 1. So it's all about in the cockpit. Then we'll move to in the cabin, then at the airport, and then inside the corporate office. And then we'll move on to infrastructure and the actual business before we finish with the epilogue. So I'm looking forward to going through so many of these parts of your life, your career, and also some of the experiences. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always, David. You're a gentleman, a scholar, you're entertaining, and as I said at the beginning, you've got a wonderful narrator's voice. So I look forward to catching up again in 2 weeks' time, and we'll go through chapter 1. And thank you so much for your time again.
I'm very much.
And I really appreciate the Christmassy jumper, David.
How about that, huh? I thought it seemed appropriate. Nice and red.
It does indeed, my friend. Yeah, you certainly look like a Christmas character.
Well, thank you for that.
And like anybody now, putting it out there now, anybody who's still got enough time to order this for a Christmas present, for anybody that's in the aviation industry or wish they had been, this is a book well worthwhile publishing. So
thanks
Turbulence,
a lot, I really appreciate
David Banmiller. No, it's our pleasure. Honestly, it's lovely. And you know, some of your quotes we'll also go through, because I love some of them. And one of the things about remaining calm under pressure is the number one. And to do what you said you did whilst you were having an aneurysm is amazing. It's remarkable.
Yeah, it was quite a time.
Yep, and well, it's good that you're here to tell the story, my friend. And we've got plenty more to tell. So look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks. Thanks for your courtesy, Chris. Take care.
It's a pleasure. Appreciate it.